The realtor, a woman with a smile too wide for her face, slid the papers across the picnic table in our own backyard. "All signed," she chirped, avoiding my eyes as Brenda tucked her hand into another man's. A sharp wind cut through me, colder than any Michigan winter. "You're still young, Frank," the man said, a smirk playing on his lips. "You'll find someone else." The motel room smelled of disinfectant and something else, something stale and old, a smell that clung to the worn carpet. Frank sat on the edge of the bed, the springs groaning beneath his weight. Outside, the highway hummed with the endless rush of traffic, a sound that seemed to mock the stillness inside him. He remembered the smell of smoke, thick and acrid, clinging to his clothes, to his hair, to everything he owned after the fire. It was a constant reminder, a phantom sensation that never truly left him. He ran a hand over his face, feeling the stubble. 2 days. 2 days since the backyard, since the papers, since Brenda's hand in another man's. He closed his eyes, pulling back into the quieter time, the time before the smoke, before the realtor, before the complete and utter collapse. It had started with a subtle shift, a lightness in Brenda that he hadn't seen in years, a sudden, uncharacteristic surge of affection. He remembered her coming into the living room, the late afternoon sun slanting through the blinds, catching dust motes in the air. She wore that yellow sundress he liked, the one she hadn't worn since before the kids were born. Her smile had been a bit too bright, a little too fixed. He saw that now, but then, he'd just seen a woman he still loved, a woman who seemed to be looking at him with something akin to genuine warmth. "Frank, honey," she'd cooed, her voice a soft murmur that had always been able to cut through his usual gruffness. "Let's go away this weekend, just the two of us." He'd been reading the newspaper, the sports section, but he'd lowered it slowly, surprised. 20 years, 20 years of steady routine, of predictable evenings, of comfortable silences that had grown longer with each passing year. A weekend trip, just like that? It wasn't like Brenda to suggest something so spontaneous. But the words, the tone, the look in her eyes, they had melted something cold inside him. A spark, long dormant, had flickered to life. A real, honest-to-goodness spark. He had felt it. A warm rush that spread through his chest. He still did. "To the coast?" he'd asked, almost sheepishly. "Our old spot?" She'd nodded, her smile unwavering. Exactly. Just like old times, and he had believed her. He had believed the casual ease of her suggestion, the way she'd leaned against the doorframe. Her posture relaxed. He had agreed without a second thought, the idea of a spontaneous trip to the Michigan coast, to the small cottage town where they had spent their honeymoon, filling him with a quiet joy he hadn't known he was missing. He remembered thinking, as he packed his worn duffel bag, that they had only gotten smarter with age. Wiser. More appreciative of these small, tender moments. It felt like a fresh start, a renewed promise, a bitter irony now. The memory of that initial thrill, that simple happiness, was now entirely poisoned, tainted by everything that came after. It tasted like ash. He looked at the peeling wallpaper of the motel room, a floral pattern that had faded to a sickly yellow. It reminded him of his own life, flayed open, its edges curling inward, revealing the crumbling plaster beneath. He saw it all so clearly now. The desperation in her overly bright eyes, the forced cheer in her voice, the almost frantic way she had tried to orchestrate this trip. It wasn't a spontaneous gesture of affection. It was a desperate attempt to cover her tracks, to build a smokescreen, to distract him from what she was doing right under his nose. How could he have been so blind? He'd walked right into it, a willing participant in his own undoing. The signs had been there, subtle shifts in her routine, vague answers to simple questions. A new watch he hadn't recognized. He had dismissed them all, choosing instead to believe in the rekindled spark, in the illusion of a renewed marriage. He had chosen to be blind, and now he was paying for it. Holed up in a room that smelled like forgotten lives, the ghost of smoke in his nostrils, wondering how he could have missed the storm gathering on the horizon. It hadn't been a sudden downpour. It had been a slow, creeping front, and he hadn't even thought to check the weather. The memory of the beach was stark against the peeling paint of the motel wall. Frank and Brenda had walked along the sand, hand in hand, the cool Lake Michigan water lapping at their ankles. The sound of the waves had been a steady rhythm, washing away the years, the kids, the mortgage. For a few hours, they were just two people, lighter somehow, transported back to a time when their biggest worry was finding an empty stretch of sand. The sun had been warm on their faces, the sky a wide, indifferent blue. Frank remembered a specific afternoon, years ago, on their honeymoon. They'd stumbled upon a sign that clearly marked a private beach, a pristine crescent of sand guarded by a weathered wooden fence. He had grinned, looked at Brenda, and she'd returned a conspiratorial smile. They ducked under the fence, feeling like teenagers, running across the forbidden sand until a groundskeeper in a golf cart had come roaring over the dune, yelling after them. Frank had pulled Brenda by the hand, laughing, their lungs burning, not stopping until they were back on public land, breathless and giddy. Remember that? Frank had asked her that weekend, pointing to a distant, tree-lined point. The spot where the private beach would have been. Brenda had laughed. A light, clear sound that had sent a familiar warmth through him. He'd squeezed her hand tighter. It was a laugh he hadn't heard in years, a sound of genuine, unburdened joy, or so he had thought. Now, replaying it in the sterile quiet of the motel room, a subtle echo of hollowness vibrated beneath the surface, a quality he hadn't recognized at the time. It was like hearing a well-tuned instrument played in an empty room, the sound ringing a little too long, a little too clean. The rest of the weekend had unfolded in a similar, seemingly perfect fashion. They'd eaten sticky ice cream cones on the boardwalk, watched the gulls wheeling overhead, and listened to the distant call of a foghorn as dusk settled over the lake. They'd talked, really talked, about old college memories, about dreams they'd once shared, about the path their lives had taken. They made love in the small cottage bed, the linen sheets cool against their skin, the windows open to the sound of the waves. It felt like rediscovery, a gentle unveiling of two people who had almost forgotten each other. He had felt it. A deep, abiding sense that they were falling in love all over again. He'd walked around those 2 days on cloud nine, the old aches and resentments of their marriage dissolving like sandcastles in the tide. He had truly believed it. Now, in the motel room, he replayed every conversation, every shared glance, every touch. He went over her words, searching for the subtle tells, the cracks he'd been too blind to see. Had her laughter been a little too forced? Her eyes, when she looked at him, had they been just a fraction too wide, too bright, like a deer caught in headlights? Had her touch, the way she'd run her fingers along his arm during a quiet moment, it's been a little too deliberate, a calculated gesture rather than a spontaneous one. The questions coiled in his gut, tight and sharp. The quiet beauty of the coast, the vastness of the lake, the gentle sweep of the dunes, it all now served as a cruel, beautiful backdrop to his shattered memories. He saw the vivid blues and greens of that weekend through a haze of ash and betrayal. The pristine scenery had been a stage, and he, Frank, had been the unwitting star of a meticulously choreographed deception. He tried to reconcile the man he was then, the hopeful, believing man, with the knot of excitement in his chest, with the hollow shell he was now, the man who sat on a sagging motel bed, dissecting every moment of what he'd believed was a rebirth. How could he have been so utterly convinced, so completely taken in by the performance? The disconnect was jarring, a canyon separating who he thought he was from who he had become in the wake of her lie. Her smile, that bright, unwavering smile she'd worn that weekend, the one that had warmed him from the inside out. It was no longer a source of comfort. It was a torment, etched into his mind, mocking him, reminding him of his own foolishness, his own desperate need to believe in a happiness that was never real. A few days after the coastal trip, after the quiet return to what he thought was their renewed home, the phone rang. It was Susie. Her voice crackled over the line, a nervous tremor underneath. Even through the cheap speaker, he could hear it. An unsettling urgency he hadn't heard from her since she was a teenager in some minor scrape. "Dad," she said, "can I come over?" I need to talk to you about something important. There was an agency in her tone, a seriousness that immediately set Frank on edge. It wasn't the usual casual, "Dad, can you help me move this weekend?" Or "Dad, are you free for dinner?" This was different. His mind, still humming with the afterglow of his perfect weekend with Brenda, suddenly lurched into overdrive. Worst-case scenarios for his daughter began to unspool in his head, each one more frightening than the last. Susie was a good kid, always had been. But life could throw curveballs. He started pacing the living room, a tight knot forming in his stomach. Was she sick? A bad diagnosis? Had she gotten into some kind of trouble with the law? Something foolish that she couldn't fix on her own? He remembered her calling him once, years ago, after a fender bender, her voice small and scared. This felt bigger. The fear gnawed at him, a dull ache that intensified with every silent minute he waited. He stopped at the window, staring out at the familiar street, but his eyes didn't see the houses or the trees. They saw only a future filled with unknowns for his daughter. The doorbell's sharp ring was a jolt, pulling him from his anxious thoughts. It cut through the quiet house like a siren. He practically sprinted to open it, his heart hammering against his ribs, a sudden rush of adrenaline making his hands tremble. Susie stood on the porch light casting long shadows behind her. Her face was pale and drawn, the usual healthy flush gone from her cheeks. Her eyes, usually so bright and full of life, were brimming, threatening to spill over. He could see the strain around them, the red rims that spoke of recent tears, or tears held back with immense effort. "Dad," she choked out, her voice barely a whisper, as if the words themselves were physically painful to utter. "I've made a terrible mistake." Frank immediately ushered her inside, his hand gently on her back, guiding her into the living room. His own heart pounded, a heavy drumbeat in his chest, a father's protective instinct roaring to life. He led her to the worn armchair, the one she always sat in, and pulled up a dining chair to face her. He tried to offer comfort, his voice tight with his own rising anxiety. "Whatever it is, Susie, we'll figure it out together. You know that. Just tell me." She shook her head slowly, her gaze fixed on the floor, unable to meet his eyes. Her shoulders slumped, and a fresh wave of tears finally spilled, tracing clean paths down her pale cheeks. She wiped them away with the back of her hand, a gesture he remembered from her childhood. "It's not me," she managed to say, her voice thick with emotion, catching on a sob. It's Mom." The air in the room suddenly thickened, growing heavy and still. Frank felt a cold, creeping dread begin to replace his initial concern for Susie. The words hung in the air, echoing in the quiet room. "It's Mom." His mind, which had been racing through scenarios of illness or legal trouble for his daughter, now slammed to a halt, hitting an invisible wall. The carefully constructed facade of his perfect weekend, of their renewed marriage, began to crack. He found himself waiting, braced, for the hammer to fall, the final blow that he suddenly knew, with chilling certainty, was coming. Susie's confession came in a rush, a torrent of words tumbling out, each one a dagger to Frank's heart. She sat hunched in the armchair, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, her eyes fixed on the worn carpet. "It started a few months ago, Dad," she began, her voice hoarse. "There's this guy at my office, Dale. His wife passed away last year. He's a good man, quiet. I just thought, well, I thought it would be nice for them to talk. You know, Mom's always been so good at listening, and he seemed really lonely." Frank just nodded, staring at her, unable to speak, the cold dread solidifying into something sharp in his gut. He remembered Brenda mentioning Susie's new coworker, a widower. He'd barely registered it. "Then," Susie continued, her voice growing fainter, "Mom started talking to me about things, how she felt stuck, how she wanted something new and exciting. She said she felt trapped, almost, like her life wasn't hers anymore." Frank shifted in his chair, a prickle of unease. Brenda had never voiced these feelings to him. Not once. He thought of their renewed weekend, the conversations, the intimacy. Had it all been a lie? Susie took a shaky breath. God, Dad, this is the worst part. I listened, and I felt bad for her, you know. She seemed so Sad. So I suggested something stupid. She squeezed her eyes shut, a fresh tear escaping. I suggested she had a one-night stand with him. Just to get it out of her system. The words hit Frank with a physical force, like he'd been punched hard in the gut. The air left his lungs in a whoosh. The room tilted. His perfectly constructed world, the one he had just started rebuilding on the coast, shattered into 1,000 pieces. A one-night stand. With Dale. His daughter's colleague. The man she'd introduced Brenda to. What are you saying? Frank managed to choke out, his voice hoarse, barely recognizable. He gripped the arms of his chair, trying to find his footing in the sudden, violent earthquake that was tearing through his reality. Mom was planning to sleep with Dale? Just once? To get it out of her system? Susie nodded, a shudder running through her. That's what she said, Dad. She said it would be a way to clear her head, to feel alive again without leaving you. Her eyes, full of anguish, finally met his. I told her to do it. I told her not to tell you. The admission hung between them, thick and suffocating. His own daughter. Encouraging his wife to betray him. He wanted to lash out, to scream, but the words were stuck in his throat, buried under layers of shock and disbelief. But I couldn't, Susie whispered, shaking her head. I couldn't keep it in. It's been eating me alive. Every time I looked at you, I couldn't. Frank's grip on the coffee table tightened, his knuckles white. The old oak surface felt solid and real beneath his shaking fingers. An anchor in a world that had just been ripped from its moorings. The room spun, the walls blurring, the familiar comfort of his living room turning into a disorienting, alien space. He took a deep, shuddering breath, trying to steady himself, trying to make sense of the fragmented pieces of information that were flying at him. He had to know. He had to know the full extent of it. He managed to choke out one more question, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. When was this supposed to happen? Susie's next words were barely audible, a fresh wave of agony twisting her features. Last night. The night after they had returned from the coast, after he had gone to bed feeling renewed, hopeful, utterly oblivious, the night he had dreamt of a future with Brenda. Believing in their shared laughter, their shared history, their renewed intimacy. The final, brutal piece of the betrayal clicked into place, stark and sickening in its clarity. The one-night stand wasn't just a plan. It was already over. The word last night echoed in the silence, a hammer blow to the fragile structure of Frank's life. He could still feel the phantom ache in his stomach, the same sickening feeling that had settled over him as Susie's confession spilled out. The realization, stark and brutal, that Brenda had been with another man, Dale, a man his daughter introduced her to while he, Frank, had been working late, meticulously cleaning up the last of the paperwork from the office, made him physically ill. The image flashed in his mind. Brenda, in their bed, in their home, with someone else. A cold wave of nausea washed over him, bile rising in his throat. Get out, he rasped, the words barely a whisper, yet dangerously low, a sound that startled Susie. She flinched, her head snapping up, her tear-filled eyes wide with alarm. Dad, please, she pleaded, reaching out a tentative hand. Just listen. I made a mistake. Get out. Frank roared, the quiet menace replaced by an explosive fury. Years of pent-up anger, of unspoken resentments, of the crushing weight of this fresh betrayal, all suddenly erupted. It wasn't just Brenda's infidelity. It was Susie's complicity, her horrifying suggestion, her deliberate secrecy. It felt like a double-edged sword, twisting inside him. How could you? He seethed, rising to his feet, his voice trembling with rage. How could you encourage your own mother to cheat? To betray me? You're no daughter of mine. Get out of my sight. The words, harsh and venomous, struck Susie, as if he had physically slapped her. She recoiled, a small, choked gasp escaping her lips, her face crumpled, and she began to sob, her apologies a garbled mess of despair. Dad, I'm so sorry, I didn't mean. I never thought. But Frank was beyond reason. The pain was too raw, too all-consuming. He couldn't hear her, couldn't process her desperate pleas. All he could feel was the burning fire of betrayal, the sickening churn in his stomach, the complete obliteration of everything he thought he knew about his family. This wasn't just a mistake. This was a fundamental breach, a tearing of the fabric of their lives. He reached out, grabbed her arm, his grip tight around her bicep. He wasn't gentle. He practically dragged her, stumbling, towards the front door. She cried out, tried to pull away, but he was deaf to her struggles, blind to her distress. His mind was focused only on getting her out, on severing this immediate, painful connection to the lie that had consumed his life. He flung the door open, the sudden draft chilling the living room, and pushed her out onto the porch. He slammed the door behind her with a violent thud, the sound echoing through the suddenly silent house. Through the frosted glass panel, he caught a final, fleeting glimpse of her tear-stained, devastated face. Her body slumped against the doorframe before she turned and stumbled down the steps. For a fleeting moment, a savage satisfaction flooded him, a grim, bitter triumph that he had finally unleashed the fury, finally pushed away the source of such profound pain. It was an image, and a feeling, that he knew, even then, would haunt him later. He stumbled back to the couch, his legs giving out, and collapsed onto the worn cushions. His body trembled, a fine tremor running through his limbs. His mind was a whirlwind of raw, conflicting emotions: anger, disbelief, humiliation, and a deep, crushing sorrow. How could Brenda do this? The woman he had spent 2 decades building a life with, the woman he had just believed he was falling in love with all over again. And Susie, his own flesh and blood, his daughter, encouraging this betrayal, then keeping it from him, until it became too heavy a burden for her own conscience. The world felt hollowed out, stripped of its color. He sat there, trembling, the echo of Susie's sobs still ringing in his ears. This is where life's costly choices truly unravel. Inviting you to stick around to the end, to see how they unfold. Frank remained on the couch, lost in a suffocating haze of shock and anger. The initial storm had passed, leaving behind a heavy, quiet, but his mind continued to churn, a relentless current beneath a deceptively still surface. The room grew dim around him, the last light of dusk bleeding away into night, painting the familiar furniture in shades of gray. He didn't stir, didn't move, just sat there, staring at nothing, absorbing the cold, hard facts that had just ripped his life apart. His body, stiff and aching from the hours of emotional strain, finally roused him from the deep haze. His muscles screamed in protest as he slowly pushed himself upright. A dull throbbing behind his eyes, he reached for his phone, lying on the coffee table where it had been since Susie arrived. A phantom hope, a desperate, illogical flicker, suggested a message might be there. Some explanation, some word from Brenda. There was nothing. The screen was blank, cold, reflecting his own empty gaze. "Of course not," he muttered, the words tasting bitter. The thought, cold and sharp, that she was probably still with him, with Dale, somewhere, enjoying herself, cemented the fury inside him. A fresh wave of indignation, sharper than the initial shock, washed over him. How could she? After their weekend, after the way he had felt, the promises he had believed in. He clenched his jaw, the muscle ticking. He pushed himself up, the movement stiff and deliberate, and stormed upstairs. Each creaking step on the familiar wooden stairs felt louder, heavier, carrying the weight of his rage. He reached their bedroom, the space that had once been a shared sanctuary, now a tainted, hollow shell. The air felt colder in here, charged with an unspoken history that had just been rewritten. He yanked open Brenda's closet door. The sharp, unexpected sound echoed in the quiet room. His hands, though no longer visibly trembling, felt tight, almost numb with barely contained rage. He began pulling out her clothes, not caring how they fell. The soft wool of her favorite sweater, the crisp cotton of a blouse, the delicate silk of a dress. He tossed them onto the bed in a haphazard, growing pile. Then her shoes, a neat row of heels and flats, now scattered on the floor. Her small box of jewelry, A simple wooden box was next. He upended it, watching the silver earrings and simple pearl necklace scatter across the quilt. Each item, once an innocuous part of their shared life, was now a memory poisoned by her betrayal. The red dress, she'd worn it on their 10th anniversary, laughing, a little tipsy, as he spun her around the dance floor. The simple pearl necklace, a gift from him after Susie was born. The silk scarf, he'd bought it for her on a business trip. Thinking of her, all of it now felt like a lie, a carefully constructed illusion. He gathered them all, a growing armload of what was once the tangible evidence of their life together, now just fabric and metal, heavy and meaningless. The house, once a sanctuary of comfort and familiarity, filled with the warmth of shared meals and quiet evenings, now felt like an empty, echoing tomb. The silence pressed in on him, amplifying the furious thumping of his own heart. A dangerous, desperate idea, born from the raw, unreasoning pain, began to take root in his mind. It blossomed quickly, from a fleeting thought into a cold, certain conviction. He stood there, in the middle of their ruined bedroom, holding Brenda's life in his arms, and a plan, dark and absolute, began to form. Frank walked out onto the patio, the cool night air biting at his flushed skin. He moved with a detached purpose, dumping Brenda's clothes, shoes, and jewelry into a messy pile on the concrete pavers. The faint smell of gasoline, which he'd quickly poured over the heap from a can in the garage, hung heavy in the air. He felt a strange quietness inside him, a cold, focused resolve that pushed out the churning chaos of moments before. His hands, despite the cold, trembled slightly as he pulled a book of matches from his pocket. He struck one, the sudden flare of sulfur and tiny flame dancing in the darkness, the small light reflected in his eyes, which felt strangely empty. "Frank," Brenda's voice, sharp and sudden, cut through the quiet night. It was loud, incredulous, filled with a shock that mirrored his own from earlier. He hadn't expected her back so soon. He turned slowly, the lit match held steady in his fingers, to see her standing at the edge of the back gate, her face illuminated by the distant porch light. Her eyes were wide with a disbelief that quickly shifted to alarm as she took in the pile of her belongings. "What are you doing?" she demanded, her voice rising, a tremor of fear entering it. The sight of her, standing there, so casually returned, so utterly oblivious to the raw wound she had inflicted, ignited something primal and furious deep within him. The controlled quietness snapped. "How was your night with Dale?" he spat, his voice dripping with barely controlled venom. Each word was carefully chosen, designed to wound, to reflect the pain she had caused him. Brenda visibly paled, the color draining from her face. Her mouth opened and closed soundlessly, like a fish out of water. Struggling for air, struggling for words, her gaze darted between him and the pile of her clothes. Then back to him. How did you?" she stammered, the question weak and bewildered. "Susie told me everything." He cut her off, his voice flat and brutal, leaving no room for denial. "How you felt stuck. How you wanted something new and exciting. How you needed to clear your head." He took a step closer to the pile, his eyes locked on hers. "Well, I hope it was worth it, Brenda. I hope he was everything you dreamed of." "Frank, please," she pleaded, her voice cracking. She took a quick step towards him, her hands outstretched as if to physically stop him, to bridge the sudden, vast chasm that had opened between them. "It's not what you think. Let me explain." But Frank was beyond explanations, beyond reason. The time for talking had passed. With a flick of his wrist, a casual, almost indifferent gesture, he dropped the burning match. The small flame caught quickly, eagerly, on the gasoline-soaked silks and cottons, a hungry lick of fire at the edges, then a whoosh as it grabbed hold, spreading rapidly. "Frank!" she screamed, the sound raw, primal, filled with terror. She rushed forward, scrambling, trying to get to the pile, to put out the burgeoning blaze. He blocked her path, stepping in front of her, his body a solid, immovable wall. He watched with a grim, chilling satisfaction as the fire began to grow, consuming the fabric, curling the edges of the plastic shoes, the air filling with the acrid scent of burning synthetics, and the faint, sweet smell of her perfumes. The heat began to radiate outwards. 20 years, he said, his voice eerily calm amidst the crackle and roar of the flames, the words cutting through the rising heat and the smoke. 20 years of memories, of a life we built, and you threw it all away for one night with a stranger. The fire, fueled by the gasoline and the rapidly igniting fabrics, spread faster than Frank had anticipated. It leaped from the pile of clothes, a hungry, living thing, licking at the wooden patio, then reaching with eager tendrils for the vinyl siding of the house. The flames began to climb, yellow and orange against the dark night sky, with an alarming speed that even in his fury surprised him. Brenda was sobbing now, her words incoherent bursts, swallowed by the roar of the fire. "I'm sorry. I never meant. Please, Frank. The house." Her voice was raw, ragged with desperation and fear. But it barely registered with him. The smell of smoke grew stronger, thickening in the air, acrid and choking. It burned at Frank's throat, making his eyes water. But still, he stood, unmoving, a silent sentinel to the destruction. He heard shouts from neighbors, their voices alarmed and frantic, and the distant, rising wail of sirens grew closer, a mournful sound that heralded the end. But Frank was transfixed by the escalating destruction, unable to look away, watching as the flames consumed what was once his home. Suddenly, a heavy hand gripped his arm. A firefighter, his face obscured by a thick, dark mask, his helmet glinting in the firelight, pulled Frank away with surprising strength. "Sir, you need to get to safety. Move back." The man's voice was muffled but urgent, cutting through the haze of smoke and his own internal chaos. Frank offered no resistance. He let himself be led, his feet moving almost automatically, feeling numb and utterly detached. It was as if he was watching someone else's life go up in flames, a spectator to a tragedy that had nothing to do with him. The familiar yard, the rose bushes Brenda had so carefully tended, the sturdy oak tree, all were now bathed in the orange glow of the inferno, distorted and alien. He found himself on the sidewalk across the street, pushed back with a small crowd of other neighbors who stood hushed and solemn, watching the spectacle. He saw Brenda huddled there, wrapped in a coarse, gray blanket, her body shaking uncontrollably. Her face was streaked with tears and soot, her mascara running in black rivulets. Their eyes met across the chaos, across the flashing red and blue lights of the arriving emergency vehicles, across the streams of water arcing towards the burning house. Frank saw fear, raw guilt, and desperate confusion in her gaze. But in himself, he felt nothing. Just an unsettling emptiness, a profound void where love and anger once resided. The man who had loved her unconditionally for 20 years, the man who had dreamed of renewed intimacy just days before, was gone, replaced by a hollow shell that simply watched. Firefighters swarmed the yard, moving with practiced urgency, battling the blaze, their figures silhouetted against the bright flames. The hoses snaked across the lawn, spraying powerful jets of water that hissed and steamed as they hit the inferno. Neighbors whispered and pointed, their faces a mixture of horror and morbid fascination. As the fire finally began to die down, reduced to smoldering embers and tendrils of smoke, leaving behind a charred skeleton of their home, a strange, profound emptiness washed over Frank. It wasn't relief. Not exactly. More like a desolate peace, the quiet after a storm. A police officer, a young man with a grim, tired face, approached Frank, notebook in hand. "Sir," he said, his voice calm but firm, "can you tell me what happened here tonight? How did this fire start?" Frank looked at him, his eyes devoid of emotion. He recounted the events in a flat, monotone voice, beginning with Susie's call, continuing through Brenda's confession and his own desperate act. He didn't care if they arrested him. He felt nothing. As dawn broke, casting a pale, bruised light over the small, charred remains of their home, Frank made a decision. The embers still smoked, a faint whisper in the cool morning air, but the fire had done its work. The house, once a symbol of their life, was now a hollow, blackened shell. He could not stay here, surrounded by the physical wreckage that so perfectly mirrored the wreckage of his life, his family, his very being. The police officer had finished taking his statement, his face unreadable, his tone professional. Brenda was still huddled on the sidewalk, watched over by a paramedic. Susie was nowhere to be seen. Without a word to anyone, not to Brenda, not to the emergency responders who still moved methodically through the debris, not to the curious neighbors who lingered on their lawns, he turned and walked to his car. It sat, a familiar and solid presence, in the driveway, miraculously untouched by the inferno. He got in, the worn fabric of the driver's seat, a small comfort against the numbness inside him. He started the engine, the familiar rumble, a low thrum that vibrated through the floorboards. He put the car in reverse, backing out of the driveway, away from the smoke, away from the silence, away from the ruins of everything he had ever known. He had no specific destination in mind, just the desperate need to put distance between himself and the charred remains of his past. The sun climbed higher, painting the eastern sky in muted colors of gray and soft pink as he sped down the highway. The landscape outside his window blurred into an indistinguishable stream of fields and trees, small towns and gas stations. He replayed the past 24 hours in his mind, a brutal, relentless loop. Susie's tearful confession, Brenda's horrified screams, the hungry roar of the fire, each image, each sound, was seared into his memory. How had it all gone so wrong, he wondered, the question a hollow echo in the quiet of the car. He searched for signs he might have missed, for moments he could have acted differently, for a way to have averted the catastrophe. But the past was immutable, solid and unchangeable, unlike the ephemeral smoke that now rose from his home. His phone began to buzz incessantly in his pocket, a persistent vibration that cut through the silence. Brenda. Susie. Probably the police, too. He ignored them all, letting the muffled sounds die away. He couldn't talk, couldn't explain, couldn't even begin to process the words that would be needed. He just drove. After several hours of aimless driving, the towns blurring into indistinguishable stretches of road, he pulled into a rundown motel. It was on the outskirts of a small, unknown town, a place that held no memories, no connections, no ghosts. The neon sign above the office door flickered, a tired red against the darkening afternoon sky. The room was dingy, smelling faintly of stale cigarettes and a lifetime of forgotten occupants. The carpet was threadbare, the curtains hung crookedly, and the air conditioning unit rattled in the window. But it didn't matter to him. It was a space, a temporary shelter from the storm that raged inside him. He closed the door, shutting out the world. He collapsed onto the threadbare bed, the springs groaning beneath his weight, physically and emotionally exhausted. The adrenaline that had propelled him through the last day and night finally left his system, leaving him drained and hollow. He lay there, staring at the water-stained ceiling, at the faint patterns of peeling paint, and the full, crushing weight of what had happened finally hit him. His marriage was irrevocably over. His relationship with Susie, his daughter, was shattered. Perhaps beyond repair. He was utterly alone, adrift in a world that felt suddenly vast and empty, having paid a heavy, burning price for his rage, for his pain, for his final, desperate act. There was no going back, no undoing what had been done, only the long, uncertain road ahead. The dingy motel room was quiet now, the hum of the old air conditioner the only sound. Frank lay on the bed, staring at the water-stained ceiling, the memory of the fire still a vivid, burning image in his mind. The smoke, the screams, the utter destruction. It had all culminated in this barren, solitary moment. He had driven for hours, the highway blurring into an endless gray ribbon under a vast, indifferent sky. Each mile was a deliberate separation from the ashes, from Brenda's shocked face, from Susie's tearful betrayal. There was no going back to the life he'd known, no patching over the cracks that had become gaping chasms. The marriage, a structure built over 2 decades, was gone, reduced to a legal formality and bitter memories. His connection with Susie, his own daughter, was a wound, fresh and bleeding, a bond severed by her complicity and his rage. He was adrift, unmoored from everything familiar. The price of his anger, the cost of her deceit, had been total. He had sought a dramatic end, and he had found it, leaving behind a scorched earth where his home and family once stood. Now, In this anonymous room, there was only the cold, hard reality of an empty future, shaped by fire and betrayal.